Manx Labour Party held its AGM a few weeks ago, so a good excuse to find out what it's all about. Do we still need a Labour movement in the Isle of Man, or has its time passed? The Labour Party was formed in 1918 to fight against the social injustice of the time, and over the century that followed, it achieved many of its initial objectives. So what's left to fight for? Does party politics work in the Isle of Man? I'm joined in the studio by party leader Joni Farragher MHK and Vice President and Douglas Councillor Devon Watson. But first, Nick Hawkes from political think tank Reatus gave a rousing presentation to the Labour AGM. What is Reatus? What's it all about?
So Reatus is a small organisation which is focused on constitutional reform. It's focused on having conversations about the political system in the Isle of Man and about how we can improve policy making, democratic accountability, and get people more engaged in politics in the Isle of Man. And we founded it a few years ago, myself and Dr. Simon Collister, and we've been working on a series of different policy areas around everything from legislative council reform to the government structure to external relations strategies, and it's been a trip.
And you're you were invited to speak to the AGM of the Manx Labour Party, not to be confused with the UK Labour Party, which of course is very busy at the moment with the elections across the water. Yeah,
I hear something's happening in the UK around elections, but I think the thing obviously that we were focused on, or that I was focused on in the speech, was discussing the next 2 years of government in the Isle of Man and the 2026 election and making some suggestions about what a policy platform should be around the Constitution in their next election manifesto.
And those suggestions, then, tell us what sort of things you were hoping that the Manx Labour Party would pick up on.
So first and foremost, it's around funding political education. So it's supporting an understanding of the Isle of Man's political system. I think that's something that's lacking in the Isle of Man. It's a relatively simple thing to do, and we've seen it deployed in countries all around the world. In Scotland, they have modern studies. In the UK, they have citizenship classes. It essentially fosters a basic understanding of politics. Added to that as well is the idea of a youth parliament. So we want to lay a groundwork from a very young age to have people engage in Manx politics. We obviously have Junior Tynwald, but that is a once-a-year kind of event, and it doesn't always have the same kind of outcomes or that you'd expect from a newer youth parliament. So places like Jersey, Scotland, Wales have deployed these youth parliaments to get people from all across the country, from ages 8 to 18, to talk about issues that matter to them and understand how the system works and how it impacts them, and feed some of their recommendations into policy making. We've seen some moves towards that with subcommittees for youth around issues around climate and housing and education, but we'd like to see that formalised going forward into an actual youth parliament. And added to that is a commitment from government or from the Electoral Commission to increase the amount of political education, political awareness raising for all ages. We want to lay the groundwork for young people, but this is really something that is an issue for people of all ages. Democratic apathy and a lack of engagement in politics or lack of understanding of the Manx political system is not just for young people, it's for everyone in the Isle of Man. A 50% turnout rate isn't just 16 and 17-year-olds, and it's going to take everyone to get that up.
You talk there about having these sort of targeted events. Most people, though, won't come. I mean, not wishing to let you down, or put down the idea, but most people won't come. Most people don't engage in politics, possibly because they think, well, actually, that's why I go to the polls once every 5 years and vote in my MHKs, because I haven't got time for all that. I want to be getting on with raising a family, making sure I've got enough money, enjoying my retirement, whatever it may be. What would you say to those people that would hopefully encourage them to take the whole political situation a bit more seriously?
I think that's an absolutely fair concern. We are in a real crisis point for many people across the Isle of Man. And it takes a lot of effort to engage in politics. It takes a lot of time. If you want to get involved in a party or if you want to turn out to these events, that is a really big commitment. But what I would say is that voting once every 5 years, that's how our system works. That's how it's set up to work. You sort of put your two crosses in a box, and you say, okay, you can kind of be my voice in Tynwald. But are we actually getting the policy decisions that people want? Well, if you look at social attitudes data, admittedly from 2019, there's very low confidence in Tynwald and in government. There's very high disaffection with political systems, and a lot of people say that they don't have a voice in policy. And one of the ways that we can get that voice in policy is to get people engaged in the political process, helping people to understand the points at which they can engage in the political process outside of just putting your vote in a box on an election day. So that's engaging in consultations, that's taking part in debates, that's coming along and learning more about the system. And if we can get one more person to get involved in politics, I think we'll say that we've done a good job, because that's really what we're aiming for. We want to broaden out the political discussion from the same people, myself included, who are just having these discussions, because that will create a better debate and will create better policy.
Council of Ministers, of course, a few months ago did have their listening to you exercise. Do you think we need more of this kind of thing? I think
that the listening to you exercise was a good first step, but I would say, what is the follow up to that? How are they going to prove that they're listening to the people on the ground? And what's going to come next from it? It's very good hosting these events and saying we're going to do all this, or not even saying that, but what comes next? How do we factor that into actually the legislative process? How do we factor that into bills coming through Tynwald? How do we factor that into policy which matters to people? So I would say we need more of that, but what it needs to be is it needs to be structured. It needs to be part of a plan. It can't just be we're going to put on some events, we're going to say we're listening to you, and then nothing comes from it. There needs to be a process so that what people say, a lot of people are putting a lot of very personal opinions, a lot of very highly emotive issues for a lot of people. How are we actually going to turn that into policy which works for them?
And we have, admittedly, a fairly ancient parliamentary system. We've got a tricameral parliament, the House of Keys, Legco, two branches, and then sitting together in Tynwald. We've got local authorities across the island in different forms and sizes. Are you wanting to sort of rip up the current structure and start again, or is it a bit of modification of what we've got, or how do you see it?
So I think there's a couple of things to that. I think some of the things that we should be looking to do, and I said this in my speech, was around shoring up our autonomy and our own constitutional status. So figuring out how we can put in safeguards to make sure that our autonomy isn't eroded and that we make the most of our autonomy. Whether or not that's having a stronger international relations platform and external relations, whether or not it's codifying some of our responsibilities, so government is very clear what it's responsible for and what the UK is responsible for. To the point about tearing up the system, at various points throughout Manx history, we've seen seismic changes in the structure of how Tynwald operates and how government operates. In the 1860s, in the 1910s, in the 1960s, and latterly in the 1980s. At various points, we've seen real change to the system of government. What we would like to see is rather than that coming from people in power, that comes from members of the public. So people are engaged in what the system should look like, whether that be local authority elections and how the structure of local authorities, because they are facing a crisis of engagement. They're also facing a crisis of responsibility and no clarity on what they're actually responsible for, and that factors into it. Whether or not that's at a national level, at national elections, figuring out how we can have a more representative sort of voting process that's more reflective of the public will, and also the government structure, figuring out how we can make government work better to deliver policy that people actually want to see. So it's not about ripping up thousands of years of tradition. It's about taking a step back and giving people a say in the future of the Isle of Man and the structure which directly affects them.
How can you get the Manx public, who will have a whole raft of different ideas and thoughts on how we could improve the system, and there will be some left of centre views, there'll be some right of centre, there'll be some that people who have views that straddle both sides of the political fence. There will be others that say there is no such thing as a political fence and that it's all one thing. How do you pull together all those views to come up with a workable system?
So this isn't about handing the keys over to the public and just saying have at it. And there are really good examples in other countries around the world where big decisions have been made through things like citizens' assemblies and mini-publics and constitutional conventions. And that's how we would see this working going forward. What we would do is look to, what we are suggesting we do is look to bring together people from across the Isle of Man, all ages, all political ideologies, all backgrounds, bring that down to a manageable number, 60, and have them basically locked in a room to discuss various different issues. So that's the electoral system, that's local authority, that's system of government. That would be fed into by experts, from the UK. Professor Peter Edge is one example of that. Other experts from other similar countries with similar systems who have went through similar processes, and they'd be tasked with coming up with that plan. We wouldn't say just go for it, just do it yourself. There would be a level of facilitation there, and that's where government would have to help, and that would take time and money. And then what we would look to do, to complete this process, is to put it out to a public vote, not a spurious kind of referendum, but a phased and structured approach to constitutional reform which gives everyone buy-in.
That was Nick Hawkes from political think tank Reatus. Councillor Devon Watson and MHK Joni Farragher join me now. So Joni, a simple question. What is the point of the Manx Labour Party?
Well, what a question to start with, Phil. So the Manx Labour Party has been around for 106 years, actually, as I discussed at this year's AGM. And it's kind of been a force for progressive politics in that time. The most MHKs we've ever had in was 8 out of the 24, which was quite a good decent haul that year, but and we'd like to emulate that and maybe more in future. But I think that's the main point of it. Is it's kind of been the social conscience of Tynwald for over 100 years, and we aim to continue to do that.
There is a kind of a collective belief, a sort of a collective folk memory, perhaps you could call it, that we've never really had Manx party politics in the Isle of Man, and yet if 8, that's a third of the members of the House of Keys at one time were party members. That's a lot more than I think many people would think. Yeah,
and I think that dialogue or that narrative that we don't do party politics over here, it's not necessarily true. We have had the Manx Labour Party for, like I say, over 100 years. We have consistently elected people as MHKs from the Manx Labour Party. Our first female MHK was from the Manx Labour Party, starting off a good tradition there. So, it's so much needed. And I think if we could really get behind our political parties, we would actually see a lot more going on in our political scene. Because at the moment, when we have so many independents with different focuses and different manifestos, it's hard to find a consensus. It really is hard to move anything along. And one of the things that we often hear in political discourse is that things move so slowly. I think we could start moving our agendas along a lot quicker if people, could maybe start seeing that political parties are a really positive, good democratic thing for our island.
And of course, one of the reasons the Labour Party was established was there was a fair amount of social injustice. There was a fair amount of disquiet on the streets. Conditions not that dissimilar to the ones that we see at the moment.
If you look at old political slogans from back in the day, people were struggling with high rents and low wages. And today you chat to the average person on the street, and those core fundamental problems with our economy still haven't been solved. And society goes through cyclical phases to a large extent, but those very much are at the foreground today, and you can see that we're offering solutions that tackle some of those problems. The living wage and the minimum wage should 100% be aligned. People should not live in poverty if they work 37 to 40 hours a week, and there is a massive lack of affordable housing, and we are the ones who help put that on the agenda again. People shouldn't be spending half their wages on rent, and people shouldn't be forced to leave the island in order to find somewhere where they can afford to live.
And how do you resolve that? Because, let's start with the minimum wage. I mean, one of the issues associated with the minimum wage is that this is seen by some, at least, as another fantastic way of government raising more taxes, because they put the minimum wage up, which automatically increases the government's tax take. People who work a reasonably full week on the minimum wage are paying the higher rate tax. Something doesn't sound quite right there.
Yeah, so if you look at what we believe as a party, we believe that a lot of value in society comes from the value of work. And we do have a problem with our tax system at the moment. So if you're working a minimum wage full time, you should only be paying the higher tax rate. That should be be folks who are doing better than average. And what we see is many middle class and working class people are struggling, and that's wrong. That's not a mark of a first world society that we like to live in. But secondly, there is a huge issue, is the fact that if you earn your money through labor, you get taxed. But if you earn your money through capital gains or through the ownership of assets or dividends, the people who are the wealthiest in society, who have the most resources, pay comparatively little tax. And in order to fund that arrangement, we have to tax working people more, which is why, as a party, what we're committed to is the idea that we need to change what we value from simple ownership of assets, which is how wealthy people make the vast majority of their income, to labor and work, which actually powers the economy. What we saw during lockdown wasn't the fact that we weren't bailed out, or the essential workers weren't folks right at the top. They were the essential workers who kept the country afloat, kept the country running, and they still haven't been rewarded for the work that they have put in. And in fact, all they've received are increasing rents and lower wages in real terms.
I completely agree with what Devin said there, but I do just want to sort of pick up that narrative a little bit, that the minimum wage aligning with the living wage will will solely bring more revenue into the tax office, because it's not just about that. So it feels a little bit as if the narrative is that it will only raise money for Treasury, but actually people will still be getting more money in their pocket as well. So the narrative that it will only make Treasury richer is not quite true. It will make people richer, and it is true that Treasury will get more in taxation to fund public services.
And I suppose perhaps I misstated the question, but businesses who have by necessity had to pay minimum wage because they are struggling to make ends meet themselves as a business, end up effectively having to find ways in which they can raise the extra money to pay for people who are not particularly well off in the world, and ultimately everyone else is solving government's problem for us.
Well, I don't think that that's the case, right? So I think that the problem with the narrative of a minimum wage is bad for businesses, and I think that it posits a view of the world which we fundamentally disagree with. So if your business is struggling, or you've got an issue with the business model, or there are rising costs in the economy, the people who should pay for that shouldn't be the lower paid workers, right? If you are struggling to run your business, you don't solve that problem by cutting down wages. And why do we say that? Fundamentally, a lot of the businesses on the island, particularly small businesses, are consumer facing. So if every business doesn't pay or pays below the living wage in terms of and to their workers, then every other business has a diluted or much smaller customer base. So that doesn't solve the problem. In reality, we should be tackling some of the systemic issues that surround small business. So we can support small business as also a decent wage economy, and that's what we look to is countries in the Nordics and in sort of Central and Northern Europe who have done this well and do provide a decent model. But businesses are struggling with high rents, and rents typically can cost as much, if not more in some cases, particularly in places like Central Douglas, than your wage bill. And by the lack of commercial and residential property we have there is driving that issue. So I think we are a party that wants to support and help small businesses, but the way you go about that isn't by cutting wages and having people live in poverty.
And sorry, on the other side of that as well, your sort of question there was around why should businesses have to fund government? But actually, a lot of people who are on the minimum wage at the moment are eligible to claim benefits because they're not getting paid enough. So actually, government is funding businesses to pay below the living wage at the moment. So, and that's not a situation that I think is spoken about very much. And it's not a situation that I think we should be finding ourselves in.
So then, I mean, you touched on housing as well. Surely there's a fairly obvious solution to solving the housing situation, and that's build more houses.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Phil. Yeah, that in itself comes with its own problems because you have to raise capital to do that, and we're kind of stuck a little bit at the moment in this situation of we don't have enough economically active people here to bring us that capital, and we need that capital to get economically active people here. It's kind of a bit of a vicious circle at the moment, but I think at some point someone's going to have to take that leap of faith and just say, let's invest in it in the hope that if we build it, they will come.
Yeah.
Is government's solution though to the problems that government's facing? I mean, because effectively, the new residence drive is primarily about increasing the amount of money that government can raise through taxes by increasing the economically active part of the population. Is that only part of the answer, though? I mean, what doesn't seem to be being looked at, and I don't know what the Labour Party, Manx Labour Party's view on this is whether government has become overburdensome and too large for the size of the society that we have here.
Okay, I think there is a huge conversation there and a discussion piece for the public of the Isle of Man, actually, because I don't think that there's enough understanding of the connection between taxation and public services. And I actually think from the emails that I receive as a public representative that we do expect first-class public services, but we aren't paying first-class taxation at the moment. So we do need to kind of make that connection between what we pay in taxation and what we receive in public services a lot stronger, because we can't have it all. We can't have our cake and eat it, I guess.
I suppose that one of the issues as well is when you talk about the size of government, we need to make sure that this conversation is not simply reductive, right? So maybe there's some places where the government is too large. So we need to have a conversation: is it right for the government to own a meat plant? Is it right for the government to sort of be operating a flour mill? That sort of thing. These are questions that we can have, but some things are absolutely non-negotiable, such as we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough teachers, and as a result, basic public services are suffering. So if you need an appointment in the NHS at the moment over here, you can be waiting for ages. People aren't seeing basic standards of care that we could have expected 10, 15 years ago. And a big problem with that is the fact that as a population ages, the amount of medical care and the amount of social services they need rise exponentially. And as a population ages, it pays much less tax because, folks, as you hit retirement age or pension age, you stop contributing as much towards things such as national insurance, which is typically the biggest outlay of government, those two services, healthcare and pension. So our relationship to tax and who pays the taxes is really important, and sort of shifting the burden in society. And currently, as the Labour Party, what we diagnose is that currently the burden of funding society overwhelmingly falls on workers, and the people right at the top need to share some of that burden too.
Joni, I mean, we almost at one point had a debate lined up with you and I think it was the former Treasury Minister about a more progressive tax system. Are you more encouraged from what you see and hear from the current Treasury Minister in relation to progressive taxation?
So it's definitely true to say that Dr. Allinson, in his manifesto when he was a candidate for the Chief Minister role, had progressive taxation and spoke about it quite a lot at the hustings. So I think it's on his agenda. However, I think he is struggling with the fact that we have financial issues. It's not a secret, is it? You know, like, I mean, I think we all know that the island is facing some financial challenges, and I think that's, you know, he's kind of maybe looking towards bigger issue, or what he thinks are bigger issues at the moment. For me, it's not moving fast enough, and you know, it's something that I am talking with Alex about in the background.
Okay, I mean, progressive taxation doesn't necessarily mean that you end up having less tax, though, does it?
No,
No, that's not the idea of it. No, so you would hope to end up with at least the same amount of tax. You know, obviously the idea is that the burden of taxation falls more heavily on the people with the broader shoulders, which, you know, seems fairest. And it's not just kind of, I mean, it's not just shooting from the hip. This has got a lot of research behind it. The countries that actually do redistribute wealth more fairly and that do have higher taxation and good public services have a more equal and happy and have good outcomes as a society, have more trust in their society. There's just so many benefits to having that system set up, and even just a small move towards it, I think, would be very, very welcome.
I also think that underfunding public services isn't a saving. So when you look at what makes the Isle of Man, or what is the Isle of Man internationally competitive, what are we the best of the world at? We are one of the safest societies on the planet, and we are also one of the most sort of socially cohesive societies on the planet. So you walk down the road and you know who your neighbours are. We live in a community, and this is one of the few places in the world I've been where you do feel that tangible sense of community. And what happens when you underfund public services? So when you have a systemic, about a sixth of the population who consistently lives in poverty, and you've got a widening society, that cohesion as a society begins to break down. You no longer see that as much. When people systemically live in poverty, then that safety issue begins to become a much greater issue. The societies that are the most unsafe are the societies that are most deprived, and we can't really make the assumption that we're going to continue to enjoy the lifestyle of living in the Isle of Man if we no longer provide services that adequately allow everyone in society to enjoy at least a moderate amount of prosperity, or a moderate amount of safety, or a moderate amount of basic economic security. And that's what we need to sort of expand.
Cutting the costs of government doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as cutting services, though, does it? It is possible, and many people will probably agree with this listening to this programme, that maybe government over-bureaucratises, if there's such a word as over-bureaucratising. I've just invented it if there isn't. The way in which services are delivered becomes incredibly bureaucratic. The further I get in life is the more I think, gosh, whatever happened to a much simpler approach to delivering public services?
Okay, and that's fair. I do think that's quite a fair observation to make, but I would also say on the flip side, we get an awful lot of complaints that things haven't been followed through in a proper process, so the bureaucracy is checkable. You can go back and say the bureaucracy makes that checkable, so we do get a lot of accusations that things haven't been undertaken in the correct manner from the general public. So actually, you know, those processes have sprung up as a direct result of that. And if we didn't have that, we would probably get a lot more of that sense of distrust between the public and government. So it's difficult to know how to really address that one. In my experience, and I'm a political member for the Department for Health and Social Care, and that's my only department. So this is my only experience. But there are, you know, it's pared down to the bone, really. There aren't even enough staff for the day-to-day activities. It's a very small department. I don't think there are any savings to be made personally, because they have such large workloads. I can't speak for all departments, and you know, there is a potential that a sort of systemic piece could be undertaken to see whether there could be bureaucracy or administrative savings that could be made.
I mean, certainly it's a favoured trope of politicians, particularly in the run-up to an election, is to say we need to cut out middle management and cut out the red tape and bureaucracy. But when it actually comes to doing it, it's often much more difficult to achieve.
I mean, often what we realise is sometimes middle managers do have important roles. So recently, within my own family, what we had was a case where at the hospital where some basic processes weren't followed, and as a result, there was almost a medical mishap that caused severe injury to family by prescribing penicillin to someone who is deathly allergic to it, right? And that comes because one of the people working there on shift had been working 12 hours and there's no one to cover them. And when we make the people on the ground who actually perform services thinner and thinner and thinner, and remove some of those management roles, remove some of those so-called bureaucratic or bureaucrats, we end up seeing that these basic procedures are much, much more difficult to enforce, and you end up having severe keyman reliance. So, I mean, a big example of this is what we're suffering with is more a lack of staff than too many staff in many, many departments. Sure, there are places where savings can be made, but look at the airport, like basic critical infrastructure falling to pieces because we can't attract those staff members. And so I think that we're looking for someone to blame for our issues as a society, and often public sector workers can take that blame because they're easy to sort of like attack. But at the same time, if there are mass firings within government and reduce that down, then that itself is a smaller customer base for local businesses. That's less people employed. That's more competition for jobs. That's greater money that needs to be spent on things like benefits rather than coming back in through taxation. So I think it's important to realize that the sort of pop solutions that some people offer do also need to be moderated by the facts on the ground.
Any overly burdensome bureaucratic systems in the Douglas City Council?
So what we've done is every year we look for positions that are no longer viable. We have found large amounts of savings from sometimes vacancies not being filled. But at the same time, when it comes to doing something such as changing over the bins, and people want these big information campaigns, and they want to have things double ticked and double checked and that sort of thing, then those things aren't possible always because the staff work exceptionally hard, and because there's constant pressure to sort of keep rates down, which we have done comparative to other local authorities. So if you compare Douglas to an authority like Ramsey or Castletown, they aren't dissimilar now. Castletown rates for average 3-bedroom property are higher, but at the same time, ideally the core issue is that people want Norwegian level public services, and they want to pay Dubai levels of tax,
which is a problem. Absolutely. Perhaps because we are in a UK election phase at the moment, it might be useful to clarify your relationship or otherwise with the UK Labour Party, Joni.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. It is useful. We do not have any affiliation or relationship with the UK Labour Party. We are standalone progressive party who've taken the name Labour, in the same way that we don't have any affiliation with the New Zealand Labour Party or the Australian Labour Party. They are a different country and we're not affiliated. So I hope that clarifies things.
Because I'm guessing it must be the Labour Party, particularly for people who've moved to the Isle of Man from the UK and perhaps haven't as yet fully embraced and understood the Manx political system, will just see Labour Party and assume it's the same thing. Yeah,
I guess so. But yeah, I mean, what can I say other than that we're not, we have our own proud tradition, and we don't really affiliate ourselves with any other Labour movement around the world, including the UK.
Okay, well, that is clear. Having mentioned elections, of course, we're approaching the end of the third year of this current House of Keys, certainly in terms of legislative sittings. Has the Manx Labour Party begun to think about the next general election?
I think people have begun to have, informal chats about it, but we haven't started any formal processes yet in terms of, sort of launching campaigns, etc. yet, or identifying candidates. No, it's just a little bit too early for us, I think, at this stage. And but yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We need to sort of start, and I suppose election fever will start a little bit now that the UK has announced their general election for July, and so that's quite exciting to see what's going on over the water.
And in terms of a future, let's be bold and say a future Manx Labour Party government, were more than 8, perhaps you've got 10 or even 12 members of the House of Keys elected, What would that election or the programme for government look like for the Manx Labour Party?
I think that there's some things, at least on my end, a lot of them have to be a continuation of the work that is already being done. So both at a local level and a national level, a lot of our elected representatives are working on common themes, and those common themes include building a more progressive agenda, building and creating more social housing, fighting for better wages for ordinary folks, and improving the way that public services need to be done. I want to hand over the leader, and the fact is we don't have to wait to have a majority or have a government in order to begin the work that we're doing. We're currently doing that work at the moment, and we
just makes it easier to have a majority.
Yeah, 100%.
But yeah, so I think, what I would like to say on that really is just that, like progressive politics or left-wing politics, it's just basically putting your focus on people, and that's really literally all it is. There's nothing radical about it. That there really isn't. It's just literally saying what actually works best for the majority of people on our island, and that is what we are constantly working towards, trying to make things better for most people on our island. So,
and well, I suppose let's talk about some of government's key priorities. I mean, the one obvious one is the economic strategy, which is all about bringing lots of new people into the Isle of Man, economically active people, to fuel the current government services. Is that something Labour would subscribe to?
So the economic strategy is based upon the KPMG report, which is literally the Labour Party manifesto, to be totally honest. It's research based. It looks at the problems on the Isle of Man and it gives practical, people orientated solutions to them. So it talks about progressive taxation. It talks about using the taxation system to decrease inequality, because we do have quite an unequal society right now. So there are lots and lots of ideas in there that we have been talking about for years and years, and that we would fully support. Yeah, but I mean, obviously not all of them, but there are. It is based upon that KPMG report, which is a good report.
I think it's also important. I think the big issue that people have is, I don't think people necessarily always have like an issue with a lot more people on the island or some increased immigration. I think that where a lot of anxieties that people share, and I share this myself, even though I am myself an immigrant at one point or another, is the fact is that we may not. The work hasn't always been put in order to ensure that those public services are ready for the people coming here. So a recent report comes out, shows we need 10,000 new homes. Our planning, we barely build 200 a year at the moment. And as an island, we don't have a planning system that has the capability of hosting these new folks yet. We don't have a healthcare system that has the ability to host these folks, an education system. Our local authorities are not geared for this. So we have had this ambition, we have had this goal put up, but we haven't seen any evidence. And I think one thing, particularly like putting away any political hat moment, just as a young person living on the island, I do feel deeply frustrated that we had a government elected that promised to do something about the housing crisis, and yet, as far as we can see, we've not even had basic renters reform that even the Conservatives in the UK have pushed, right? So if our government is behind renters' rights and even the UK, what hope is there that they're going to get the bigger ticket items done that are required to actually have more people on Ireland?
Joni, I mean, you are relatively new in the House of Keys. Is it a lot more difficult than you thought it was going to be?
Yes, is the short answer. I think things move so slowly, and gaining consensus is your first task. So there's a lot more work that goes into anything that you want to do before you would bring it into the public arena, because you first of all need to check that you will have support for it, and there's no point really in bringing it if you won't. So yeah, there's an awful lot of work that goes on behind the scenes for everything that you see publicly. I mean, and you'll know that yourself, Phil. We do have quite a small number of political representatives compared to other jurisdictions, and quite a small amount of administrative support as well. So, our workload would tend to be slightly higher than that of political representatives in other jurisdictions as well. So, yeah, I would say it's a lot different from what I thought it would be. There's and it's slower. It's frustratingly slow. It's like wading through treacle a lot of the time to try and bring change.
And of course, you're you've sort of put a great bit of promotion forward there for why perhaps we need party politics in the Isle of Man, because
that's where I was going to. Yeah.
so much of the time of politicians is spent trying to persuade others of the value of a particular cause or a particular political direction.
Absolutely.
Which then means that you get frustrated because things don't move as quickly as they should.
I think that a great value of a party as well is it acts as a giant coordination mechanism. So voters all over the island and residents all over the island have very similar goals, but MHKs themselves might not always have similar goals. So parties offer people quite a lot of things. Firstly, you get direct access to local representatives at monthly meetings or far more often. So you can directly ask them, hey, can you put a question in for me? Can you have the ability to sort of like query this? Can we get access to information as to how the political system works? And secondly, it means that a voter in Ramsey and a voter in Douglas and a voter in Castletown can all say, hey, listen, we don't like the direction that things are going in right now, or public services aren't where they should be, so we can all collectively work together with our votes in order to reach those common goals. And an independent system doesn't always allow that same level of coordination at the end of the day, because that accountability isn't there. Individual MHKs can resign or come and go, whereas if a party does badly, you can hold the party collectively accountable for the actions that the party undertakes while in government. And that's one of the big issues is, at the moment, it's very difficult to hold people accountable.
Because, of course, when it comes to an election, everyone knows that most of what happens in the Isle of Man in terms of public policy and service delivery is done by the government. The government primarily is formed by the 9 ministers and council of ministers, and the only democratic accountability they have is through the House of Keys election, and they do not stand on a council of ministers ticket. Indeed, I was quite surprised, I have to say, when I interviewed the chief minister over the Easter time, that when I said, do you actually believe in your government's policies, he said something along the lines of, they're not my policies. They are Council of Ministers' policies, which kind of then implies that maybe he doesn't agree with them all, which is quite an admission, I thought.
I would imagine that the Chief Minister has got a more progressive Council of Ministers than he necessarily might have wanted. But he is supposed to be first amongst equals, isn't he? So I can see why he's saying it would be the Council of Ministers' agenda rather than his specifically. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it's so important to bring out that the Council of Ministers don't have any more mandate to actually decide the agenda of an administration than the rest of us do. It's quite arbitrary, really, that we have this system. It feels to me like we've created that in place of a political party system, and we should just accept that we should bring in a political party system instead.
Well, you can think that, of course. One of the things that surprises me, perhaps, is that there are quite a number of progressive party politics or political parties, I should say, on the Isle of Man. We have the Green Party. McVannon is generally a kind of left of centre progressive type party. Even Liberal Vannon, I suppose, is a progressive party. Wouldn't it be better if all you progressive political types bandied together and formed one party rather than having all these disparate parties? And perhaps then you could make a significant breakthrough.
They're always welcome to join.
I would like to issue an open invitation to them to join the Manx Labour Party.
No, but I think that one thing that we do see, at least on a local level, at least in Douglas Council, 5 out of the 12 members are members of political parties, and that includes both Greens and Labour. But at the end of the day, Green and Labour, at least at local level, have different sort of goals that they want to achieve, and we do work together to sort of achieve joint aims. I wouldn't be in the position I'm in terms of having chairmanship of social housing for Douglas if it wasn't for help with the Greens and vice versa with their help within regeneration. And it's one of those in which progressives do work together here. But I think it's also important that voters also have that variety of choice at the end of the day. I mean, if you've got slightly more sort of market-based type of ideals, Lib Vannon is open there for you. If there are certain environmental agendas that you're looking for and aren't as worried about sort of certain issues of economic justice, there are other parties there. But yeah, so I mean, we're very clear on where we stand, and I think that we're happy to work with other parties and always.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're a local politician, Devon.
Allegedly.
Well, I know that you are. And Joni, you're a national politician. Do you think that the people you represent understand that there perhaps is a difference between national and local politics?
Yeah, I think they do, yeah. I occasionally get emails that I would redirect to the local politicians, but quite rarely really, and often even when they are, it's more like, I know this is actually a local authority issue, however I would like your input, for example. So I do think most people do understand the difference. What's your experience?
Yeah, 100%. I think that because the way that we structure our services is sometimes a bit strange. So the fact that housing is an issue that is handled by local authorities, but a parking space near your house is something handled by national government. Sometimes the things aren't always paired up in a sensical way, but for the vast majority of things, I think that people do know the difference, and I think that people do engage. And I think people are willing. But I think that's another benefit of party politics, not to continue plug on the theme, but the fact is that if you have a bunch of local level councillors within a party and MHKs within a party, it makes coordination between those two bodies much, much, much easier. So if I've got a query about housing or issues around housing, I know that no matter what, Joni and Sarah as MHKs are going to sort of echo that position within Tynwald. And that makes being a local politician much, much easier at the end of the day, knowing that you have that access to information, knowing that you have that access to representation.
Of course, in the UK, local government does an awful lot more, and quite clearly people pay a lot more for the privilege of having their local authorities doing more. Is that a direction you think that the Isle of Man might wish to follow at some point in the future? Do you think possibly trying to share the load between local politicians and national politicians a little bit more is a good thing?
I think you would probably come back to the issue of funding again, and I know we've kind of discussed that a little bit, but I think we do need to maybe gauge the public's opinion on what they want to pay and how that interacts with the services that they want to receive. Personally, I think it would make sense to share the load of some of those services out to local authorities. I don't know what Devon thinks about that. We haven't discussed it, but we do have such a different structure that it can be quite confusing for people that our local authorities don't deliver any of those services. And we do have quite a high number of local authority politicians, so it's feasible. What do you think?
I do think that there are broader issues with the structure of local authority reform. So, I mean, I think that not all local authorities are sort of created equally. We have very hotly contested elections in Douglas, and some places have hardly ever had a competitive election. So, and I think at the same time, the level of services provided varies widely between rural and more centralized local authorities within towns. So I think that if there is going to be any measure there, the very first step needs to be A, sort of either consolidating or engaging in a wider set of sort of local authority reform, and B, sort of taking a look at the fact that if we're taking any MHK responsibilities and shifting them to the local level or vice versa, I think one thing that does need to be looked at is that issue of exactly like how do we fund this and how do we share that? Because if you look at local authorities over here, they're almost entirely funded by rates, whereas in the UK, maybe 30 to 40% of their income comes from local taxation, and the vast majority comes from central government grants. So they're very different beasts, and they behave in very, very different ways. But there's certainly a lot more that local authorities could do. And the biggest of that is sort of consolidating and growing their core responsibilities. And the first major part of that is housing. I'm always going to talk about housing, but local authorities need to be building a lot more housing, and rather than sharing responsibilities, there needs to be sharing of funding to make that happen.
That was Labour Party leader Douglas East MHK Joni Farragher and Party Vice President and Douglas Councillor Devon Watson. So what do you think? Do we need a strong political force to help tackle the housing and cost of living crises? If so, could the Manx Labour Party be that movement for change? And if you feel that party politics doesn't work in the Isle of Man, how do you explain the century-long successes of the Manx Labour Party? For now, I'm Phil Gaughan. Gora Maius and Geistach Rum. Thanks for listening.